Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. And this week's guest is actually really quite topical. And it's going to make it look like I'm the sort of efficient person who looks what's going on TV and stuff and goes, right, I must get somebody who's written the hot show of the week on TV. This is absolutely not true. He just happens to be a mate of mine, and I suddenly saw that he had a big thing on TV this week. And I thought, oh my God, I've never done a podcast with him. He's an actual mate. I have access to him. His name is John Preston, and you must have read about. If you live in England, you will definitely have read about it. It's this new drama series based on the extraordinary shenanigans involving the Liberal MP Jeremy Thorpe. Welcome, John Preston, to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, John, I'm kind of envious, but I'm not full of hatred of you because I like you so much that actually I want one of your books to do well, and this must be the book that's done better than any other.
Unquestionably.
So remind me what it's called.
It's called A Very English Scandal.
And it's bloody good. I mean, I read it. I read it when it came out, so which is why I can't remember even the title. But it's an absolute hit, and deservedly being turned into this TV series with Hugh Grant.
With Hugh Grant and Ben Whishaw and various other people.
And written by Russell T Davies, the guy who revived Doctor Who.
Absolutely.
So you must be quids in, and B, you must be delighted.
I'm absolutely delighted. Contrary to a lot of reports, I sadly do not have to take my family off to live in the Cayman Islands. You know, it's fine, but I don't get as much money as people think.
Okay, but it's how many parts is it? 3. And presumably, because we have a dear special American listener, a dear special friend who lives in South Africa and one in Australia. Will they ever get to see this stuff?
Absolutely. So essentially it goes out on BBC One for 3 weeks and then it goes out on Amazon.
Oh, well, okay. And it's about perversion, isn't it, at the very heart of Parliament?
Yes, it's about certainly a cover-up, and it's about a very peculiar moral and political climate that existed only 50 years ago. And it's a story that actually, I think all really good political scandals need a kind of moral backdrop to be projected against. And here the moral backdrop is homosexuality. Homosexuality had been decriminalised in this country in 1967, and this case takes place in the 1970s. But although homosexuality had been decriminalised, the stigma against homosexuality certainly hadn't gone away. In fact, if anything, it had become more overt in the years following 67, because if you were gay, your head, as it were, was sticking out more invitingly above the parapet, and there were no shortage of people to lob coconuts at it. And none of this story would ever have happened if the prejudice against homosexuality hadn't been so great.
Right.
Because Jeremy Thorpe was the leader of the Liberal Party. He'd had an affair with this young man in the early 60s, and he knew that if any whiff of that ever got out, he would be completely sunk.
Despite being the Liberal Party.
Yes, exactly.
Who ought to have believed in all that kind of thing, almost as compulsory.
Well, I mean, the thing about Thorpe was that although he was, a mass of extreme contradictions, he wasn't actually a humbug in that respect. I mean, he did vote in favour of homosexual law reform. But he nonetheless wanted to keep it quiet.
Was he married or not?
Yeah, he got married for the first time because he became leader of the Liberal Party, and he decided that he needed a wife, essentially to boost his standing in the polls. So he got married, and then, amazingly, had a very successful marriage and had a son who he doted on, found that he loved his wife. His wife was then killed in a car accident, and Thorpe married again the divorced wife of the Queen's first cousin. And they had a very happy marriage as well.
So why did he carry on dabbling, or didn't he? Was this his past?
Yeah,
that
I think
up with
he
him?
did. No, I think he tried to put kind of things under wraps a bit once he got married. but not that successfully. I think he was basically bisexual, but he was, as he said, more gay than heterosexual.
I've been dying to ask you this because I think you addressed this in the book, if I remember rightly. Why does the Liberal Party attract so many pervs?
Well, that is a killer question. The Liberals at the time that Thorpe was the leader only had something like 9 or 10 MPs, and they were all really weird. I've no idea. I remember interviewing the historian David Starkey once, and I said to him, I can't remember why, I said, why do academics argue so much? And he thought about it and he went, because the stakes are so small. And in a funny sort of way, the same thing is true of the Liberal Party. The smaller the numbers, the more they were at one another's throats.
Was Cyril Smith
an
MP at the time?
No, Cyril Smith was the Liberal chief whip. So in theory, he was the kind of moral conscience of the Liberal Party. Cyril Smith shared an office, quite a small office, I don't know how they both fitted in, with Clement Freud. And I didn't know anything about Clement Freud when I was writing the book. So that came out subsequently.
Well, he was Sigmund Freud's son or
grandson.
Okay, yeah.
So he was Lucian Freud's brother.
And what was? I know he did dog meat commercials.
Yes.
What other weird stuff did he do?
He essentially sexually abused his underage lodger.
Male or female?
Female.
Okay, so that's nasty, but probably not as nasty as the vile Cyril Smith, who was how much did he weigh? About sort of 20.
He must have weighed about 22 stone, I think. Okay. Yeah,
and he serially abused young boys with the complicity, I think, of his local party and the local council, and just
not only that, actually, because the main reason that the story about Cyril Smith remained buried for so long was that on the eve of the Jeremy Thorpe trial in 1979, a story had appeared in a kind of student newspaper in Rochdale, which is Cyril Smith's constituency, repeating these claims that he had abused young boys. And Jeremy Thorpe's barrister, thinking that this might prejudice the case against his client, sent out a letter, a round-robin letter to all newspaper editors on Fleet Street saying, if you repeat these allegations against Cyril Smith, that will prejudice the case against my client, Jeremy Thorpe. And everybody sat on the allegations for the next 30 years.
Blimey. So media censorship, such as they're trying to enact in the House of Lords at the moment, has been with us for quite some time.
Very much so,
yeah. I have a theory about Liberals and actually the left generally, but people who are attracted to join the Liberals or the Liberal Democrats, which is that they adopt all these liberal causes in order to cover up or sort of whitewash the inadequacies of their own lives. So they might be having filthy private lives, but they adopt these unimpeachably good causes, at least in the eyes of the liberal establishment, in order to show that they're okay, really.
Yes, certainly I suppose the case of Thorpe would tend to bear that out.
I imagine he believed in all the good things, didn't he? Whatever the liberals.
No, I think one of the very peculiar things about Thorpe was that, he was the leader of the most socially progressive party in the country at the time. There was a photograph taken in about 1968-69, shortly after he'd become Liberal Party leader. And there's a Remembrance Sunday, the Armistice Day thing going on at the Cenotaph, and the three party leaders are there. There's Ted Heath, Harold Wilson, and Jeremy Thorpe. And Ted Heath and Harold Wilson are wearing what used to be known as lounge suits, whereas Thorpe is wearing full Edwardian morning coat, and this kind of absurd double-breasted waistcoat and everything like this. So he, in many respects, he was a figure from another age.
Right.
With some of the attitudes to match.
I would have supported that element of his character. I mean,
the dandyism.
Well, yeah, but also the old values. Because you just mentioned Ted Heath and Harold Wilson, two of the worst prime ministers we've ever had, I would say, and yet we're often given, are we not, to sort of ubi sunt, where we look back on the great age where politicians had hinterland and they'd all served in the war and they were all men of principle, and actually probably they weren't.
Yeah, I can't imagine that many people look back fondly at Ted Heath's premiership, or even possibly at Harold Wilson's. I mean, as you know better than me, in the early 70s, Britain was in such a state of kind of utter meltdown.
Just complete collapse, economic collapse.
So in 1973,
everything.
there were two general elections. In the February general election, Heath didn't get a majority and called in Jeremy Thorpe to number 10 to discuss forming a coalition. So Thorpe, if he'd played his cards right, could have kind of been the Nick Clegg of his day and been a cabinet minister. As it was, he overplayed his hand because he demanded proportional representation as the price of any deal. And however desperate Heath was to stay in power, he knew that the Tories were never going to buy that.
Yes, because it might have led to in the future, can you imagine? Imagine if there'd been a coalition between the leader of the Conservatives, like David Cameron, and the leader of the Liberal Democrats, like Nick Clegg. I mean, imagine what a disaster that would have been for the country. So I'm going to ask you now to completely ruin the plot. What happened? How did he come unstuck?
Okay, so essentially what had happened was early 60s, Thorpe met this young man called Norman Scott, who was working as a stable boy for a friend of Thorpe's in the Cotswolds. They subsequently had an affair. When the affair broke up, Scott went off with some letters that Thorpe had written him, and to cut a very long story short, he started telling everybody who would listen that he'd had an affair with Jeremy Thorpe, that his life had been ruined. He would show them the letters, and Thorpe began to get more and more edgy as Thorpe moved up the kind of political ladder.
Right.
So Scott became more and more talkative, and the stakes became higher and higher, and eventually Thorpe snapped and he siphoned off 10 grand, or at least he got friends of his to siphon off 10 grand from Liberal Party funds to pay a hitman to bump off Norman Scott. But the hitman, who was a man called Andrew Gino Newton, was probably the most incompetent hitman in the history of disorganised crime. So first he went to Dunstable in Bedfordshire looking for Scott. Couldn't find him, couldn't understand why, only to realise that actually Scott lived in Barnstaple in Devon. So he went down to Barnstaple and eventually befriended Scott under the guise of, claimed that he'd been sent by some mysterious benefactor in Canada to protect him, and drove him up onto Exmoor one wet and windy night, got out of the car, shot Scott's Great Dane dog called Rinker, who was also in the car. Then the gun jammed. Newton drove off into the night, and stained with the blood of his dog, Norman Scott ran out, flagged a car down, and when the police turned up, he said, "It's all the fault of that terrible man, Jeremy Thorpe. He's trying to kill me."
We laugh, don't we? But actually, Rinker was a real dog with probably real hopes for the future. I remember vividly the name Rinker. What year was this?
This was it 73 or 74? No, I can't remember. I have to look at my notes.
That would have been the time when I was at a typical English prep school. I think you probably would have been to a similar establishment where the only paper we were allowed to read was the Daily Telegraph, which had particularly lurid court reports on page 3. So you got all the details. So we know, and we had obviously bent music teachers trying to molest us, so we are familiar with that aspect of life as well. But Rinker, it sticks in the memory, just as all the details of Jonestown stick in the memory. You know, when you're a kind of 11-year-old boy, you just remember all this stuff vividly.
Yeah, don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, but it was very sad about Rinker the dog, and I think the reason this story appealed to you is because you do have this particular register in your book. I think I've read all your books, and they're very, very good, and they're very special because you've got a very distinctive voice, which is you're amused and sort of slightly detached. And how would you characterise your style?
What I always loved about the Thorpe thing, was that it was this extraordinary mix of tragedy and farce, and you've got these kind of ludicrous Ealing comedy aspects to it, like the guy mistaking Barnstable for Dunstable and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you strip the Ealing comedy aspects out of it, it's also a rather poignant story about a love affair gone horribly wrong, about betrayal, about male friendship gone sour. So there's a kind of emotional kernel at the heart of it, and essentially all the key protagonists, their lives were ruined by this. They didn't just kind of brush it off and say, "Oh, what the hell? I'm going to, start over." It was absolutely catastrophic. None of them were ever the same again.
But I imagine, because knowing the tone of the book, I imagine that this adaptation is going to have this element of farce about it.
Yeah. Well, Norman Scott, who is mercurial to say the least.
Oh, because you've met him, haven't you?
Oh yeah, no, I spent
Is he still with us?
With Norman. Yeah. He's the only protagonist who's still with us.
And what's he like?
Changeable.
Right.
I mean, we got on pretty well. To begin with, I went down to see him.
I like that.
No, actually, no, we got on well throughout the book.
Yeah.
And then things, he didn't like the book, he said, to begin with. Then he decided that he loved it. And then he decided he didn't like it again. And I honestly don't know what he feels about it.
Then he called a hitman.
So, yeah, he's very much still with us.
Right.
And still, very aggrieved about what happened to him.
Right, that's the thing, isn't it? Despite the farcical element, these are all real people. I mean, what would you do if you were rising up the political ladder and this person started effectively blackmailing you? I mean, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you would call a hitman, but I mean, if any of us had been in that situation, I think it'd be pretty bloody awful.
Oh, I think it was terrible for Thorpe. I mean, I suppose the key factor here is that Thorpe tried to get Norman Scott killed, and Norman Scott didn't try and get Thorpe killed.
Yes.
Nonetheless, I did feel very sorry for Thorpe in some respects, because he was in this terrible, terrible pickle.
Yeah.
And, it's always interesting to see what happens when people get pulled out of shape. What do they do when they're put in this kind of absurd position,
Well, in one of your previous books, you wrote about the yachtsman, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Well, there was a character based on Donald Crowhurst, the round-the-world yachtsman. Yeah.
Who in a way was in a similar dilemma.
Yeah,
exactly. He got into... Just remind me what he did.
Well, Crowhurst set off... There was a Sunday Times round-the-world yacht race in, I think, 1968.
Yeah.
And Crowhurst, who was a kind of rather slightly sort of eccentric inventor who lived down in Devon, decided...
That's where it all happens.
Yeah, it all happens in Devon. So he set off in this boat, but he was hopelessly ill-prepared, and his boat started sinking almost immediately, and he managed to limp across the Atlantic, and he holed up off the coast of Brazil, and he waited until all the other contestants had gone round the world. Then just as they were coming into view, he pulled out, and they went, "My God, Donald Crowhurst has overtaken the whole lot of them." And he thought at that point, well, I'll just kind of, if I can come home third or fourth, it'll be fine. I'll kind of, honour will be intact. Yep. But then everybody ahead of him started sinking, and he got to the point where he was leading the race, and he knew that if he came home first, he was completely stuffed, because they'd find out that he cheated. So he basically committed suicide.
Yeah. So again, you see, it's funny.
Yeah.
But it's but it's sad. And by the way, haven't there been 2 films about that recently?
There's
one
been
of
a
which was
documentary
nixed.
and a feature film. Yes,
I think there were 2 in production, and one of them bought out the other one because there was competition.
Right. Well, you may, yes, possibly.
Yeah. But you presumably didn't get any development, any money for that because it wasn't based on.
It wasn't based on
your
absolutely.
book. Before you were researching this particular book, did you ever meet Thorpe or any of the other players?
No, but I'd always been fascinated by it, and I remember when I came to live in London, the Thorpe trial was going on at the Old Bailey in '79, and at the time there were 2 London evening papers. There was the Standard and the Evening News, and the vendors would shout out what they thought was the most enticing headline to try and get people to buy them. And I would kind of rush from one tube station to another, hoping that another dispatch would have come through from the Old Bailey. And it seemed to me, and it wasn't a completely fanciful idea, that the whole of London was just kind of completely galvanised by this, and indeed the country. And
as they were, actually.
As they were. Because it was so bizarre, and never before had a public figure been revealed to have been gay, and within 6 years Thorpe had been he'd gone from being on the verge of forming a coalition government with Ted Heath to standing in the dock at the Old Bailey accused of conspiracy and incitement to murder, and they were the most serious criminal charges ever levelled against a sitting MP. But I'd kind of toyed with the idea of doing something for years and years and years, and I couldn't work out how to get a new angle on it. And then, quite by chance, I happened to find there was a man called Peter Bessel, who'd been a fellow Liberal MP and a friend of Thorpe's, who turned against Thorpe and became the chief prosecution witness against him in the trial. And Bessel had written a privately printed memoir, which I finally got hold of, which turned out to be complete dynamite. So I went, oh God, this is fantastic. And pretty much the same week, or about a week later, I was having supper with a friend of mine. I said, I'm interested in doing something on the Thorpe trial. And this friend of mine said, do you want to meet Norman Scott? Because he lives in the same village as my sister-in-law. So I went, yes. So I drove down to Devon the next week, met Norman, and it all kind of went on from there.
Yeah.
And Thorpe was still alive at the time, but it was then something like 85, and had Parkinson's disease for 30 years. So I knew he wasn't going to be around forever, and indeed he died only about 2 or 3 months later, and I gate crashed his funeral at St Margaret's, Westminster.
Did you?
So so that kind of got me started. Well, it was very interesting because all the surviving leaders of the Liberal Party were present. I think because Nick Clegg had told them to
with their kind of underage lovers and their press agents.
And it was extraordinary. And there was Thorpe's coffin draped in a Union Jack with his Homburg hat on top of it, and it was a rather moving funeral, actually.
You lucked out with the manuscript and stuff, didn't you? I mean,
I lucked out with the manuscript.
Great.
I lucked out in terms of timing. I lucked out in all kinds of ways, actually.
Yeah. Well done. Of course, you put me in the unfortunate position now. I've got to review it, and and I'm going to have to declare an interest, and I'm going to have to, if I hate it, I'm going to have to find a way of being really polite just to say the because weirdly enough, I had dinner with Stephen Frears a couple of weeks ago, who, as you know, directed it. I never met him before, and when he discovered I was a TV critic, he was weirdly solicitous. I mean, it's just weird. Maybe I was imagining it, but it just seems odd that somebody of that eminence, I remember Prick Up Your Ears, didn't he direct that? He's been around the block.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That he really couldn't give a damn anymore what people think about his stuff. But
no,
clearly...
I think he's as edgy now as he was then. Right. Actually.
Okay, you're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest and friend, John Preston. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Why did we see some of the Republican kissing of Mark Zuckerberg that was taking place?
I called it kissing the ring because I felt like every single person practically had to kiss the ring of this guy, who wants to do nothing except get all those people out of office. So, bizarre behavior from the Republicans.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very good friend, John Preston, author of, see how well I prepare for these things. Tell me the name of it again.
A Very English Scandal.
A Very English Scandal with Hugh Grant, directed by Stephen Frears. Did you go on set?
Oh, yeah.
And?
Well, it was great, actually, because everyone was incredibly nice to me. And I've got 2 young children, and I took them on set once. And I could see them, I introduced them to Hugh Grant and Stephen Frears and various people. And I could just see them looking at me and thinking, maybe our father isn't such an ass after all. And then, the waters kind of closed again. They thought, well, actually, he probably is. So it was very gratifying in that respect. And, it was fun being on set. You don't want to hang around a film set that much because it's actually quite dull. But,
yes, and indeed.
Good for one's ego.
And particularly given that you're not involved.
Exactly.
You didn't even write the script, for God's sake.
Exactly.
So you've got nothing to do. So you're slightly embarrassing to everyone.
Exactly. You're really a bit of a spare dick, but, it's okay.
And there is no glamour either, is there, in filming? I mean, you must have made films before now.
No, it kind of depends how glamorous you find it, sort of huddling around a tea urn.
Well, you get up early to catch the light, which is a real pisser about being in the film industry, or even making a documentary, and endless takes.
Yeah,
it's a real
grind. Absolutely.
I suppose if you get to Hugh Grant's level, you get to shag whoever you want, and you get to be quite rich. Although apparently, I read in the paper today that he says he's too old to play romantic.
Oh, I saw that.
And he's ugly and old. I know exactly how he feels. But that thing that you had with your children, I went through this as well. That when they reach a certain point, and I think your kids must be about the right age now, where they actually know who the celebrity names that you drop are.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. Whereas previously, I'd be saying to my kids, well, look, here's an autograph of Tom Hanks, and Daddy went to interviewed Samuel L. Jackson, and they did not give a shit. Who are these people? They don't present daytime kids TV. They don't matter. And then suddenly there was that point where they flicked. And suddenly, Dad isn't so crap. It's a great moment in the life of every father.
Yeah, exactly.
Because no man is a hero to his valet or his children.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like me, you've had a career in the world of journalism, arts. In fact, I owe you enormous amounts.
Do you?
Yeah, you've
Why?
forgotten this. You were the bloke who gave me my job as a rock critic.
Oh, so I was. That's true. I'd forgotten.
Yeah, exactly. This is the problem.
Yeah,
We've been around so long.
Yeah.
And I don't know why it was you decided to give me a job as a rock critic, given that I'd never been a rock critic before. But I mean, it opened so many doors to me. I mean, I saw lots and lots of gigs which I'd never have gone to otherwise. Mm-hmm. I got loads and loads. I got an enormous record collection. It might have helped me pull my wife.
Might well have done.
Which is a result. So I'm going to say, to all my special friends out there, thank you, John Preston, for making my life less shit.
That has been my pleasure.
So, but do you feel the same way as I do about all the famous people I've met in the past? That it feels slightly unreal that the person who did that, I can't quite believe he did it. At the same time, wasn't it incredibly anticlimactic? I mean, they were very, very rarely that exciting meeting these people.
I've kind of forgotten almost everybody I ever interviewed.
Yeah, isn't
and then periodically a name will come up.
Yeah.
My kids were talking about Taylor Swift the other day. I thought, oh God,
you didn't?
Yeah, I did interview Taylor Swift, and I thought, God, and they all, actually
that
again
must
they
have
got
been early on.
Yeah, it was early on. Yeah, and I kind of interviewed people, as you did, on a weekly basis, and it's changed so much because when I started doing it, there was no time limit. I remember spending what seemed like days with Warren Beatty in LA and thinking, how am I ever going to get away from this? It's just a nightmare. I really had enough.
Probably lots of
keeps
people
talking
said
at me, and whereas now, if you're lucky, you get kind of 10 minutes at some sort of junket.
It's much more controlled now,
much more controlled, because PR people can control it, whereas actually it used to be, I suppose, agents and actors and so on.
We didn't know we didn't know we were born in those days. We didn't know how lucky we were. I remember going to interview Jennifer Jason Leigh. Do you remember her?
Yeah, of course.
Possibly for you. And her agent sat in on the interview, and the interview was an hour, and she knitted throughout the interview and just kind of listened out for any inappropriate questions. Is Jennifer Jason Leigh a lesbian? I can't remember.
No idea, actually.
No. Anyway, I suppose that was the kind of question she didn't want me to ask. But I remember feeling affronted, absolutely affronted, that my special time with a star was being policed by... Normally we just got away with... I mean, I had an hour with Tom Hanks, an hour with Samuel L. Jackson. Isn't it fair to say that everything's gone to shit since we were journalists?
Yeah, but what's weird about those interviews, I suppose, I mean, I agree with everything has gone to shit. But,
thank you.
But they're very peculiar because you're stuck in a room with someone for an hour that you've never met before. You're never going to see them again, and it's an incredibly artificial atmosphere. But actually, you can, if things go well, end up having weirdly intimate conversations with them, because you can ask them things that you would never normally ask someone in a kind of social context. Yeah. And quite often they'll tell you. And some people, of course, treat the whole thing like a giant therapy session. So you get, ostensibly quite reserved people start telling you astonishing details about, their innermost emotional problems and sex lives and Christ knows what else.
I was watching TV the other day and I saw Diana Rigg on. And
I remember you interviewed her.
I was about to say, I was thinking to myself at the time, God, I'd love to meet Diana Rigg. And then I suddenly remembered I've spent an hour with Diana Rigg and got on with her enormously. Yeah. I think the big advantage I had in those days was that I was not politically formed. So I didn't even enter the realm of their views on this and that, or if they did venture a political view. I just went fine. Whereas I think now I might sort of challenge them on it or say something stupid. I came horribly unstuck once when I interviewed the worst interview I've ever had. I didn't think I did him for you, Michael Mann.
Oh yeah, the director,
the movie director. Yeah, absolutely. And he'd made a film about smoking,
The Insider, with Russell Crowe,
which is really, really dull. I didn't like the movie, and I'd broken my leg. I'd fallen into a ha-ha at Susanna Herbert's wedding, where you were as well, I think, were you?
No, I wasn't.
No, okay. I fell into the ha-ha, and I'd broken my ankle, and I was just recovering sufficiently to wear one of those boots that you wear. But as a result, I was kind of late to the interview, and so it didn't get off to a good start, because I think he rather felt that as a director, journalists ought to turn up on time and stuff. And I took issue with the politics of the movie, saying, well, actually, I'd felt rather sorry for the tobacco industry having to defend itself when after all everyone knew that cigarettes gave you cancer, and I just didn't like the Russell Crowe character, and he absolutely hated me, and he just flipped completely, and as the interview got worse and worse, and I realised how much he hated me, I started goading him, and I sort of pointed out how cheesy what was that series that he did called
Miami
Vice was, and it just got worse and worse and worse. It was horrible. But looking back, I can't believe that we lived in such times. It was the end of journalism. I mean, do you have a view on that, on the way journalism's gone now? Or do you engage?
Well, the
much
trouble
in
is,
it?
it's so. I think any view I have is so informed by personal bitterness. It's probably not worth it.
No. I think bitterness is good.
But I mean, and actually, in a funny sort of way, I don't care that much, because I think, Jesus, how lucky I was that I managed to kind of last as long as I did. And if I'd been 10 years younger or 20 years younger, it would have been impossible to have a career. Whereas actually we had pretty good careers, and we got away with it.
Yeah, we got away with it. But do you not think, I'm encouraging here as your therapist to talk about this, because I think we journalists of a certain generation need to get this off our chests, that it's so bloody unfair that we are handloom weavers in the age of the spinning jenny, and we've just been shafted by technology, by these horrible, nasty little kids who haven't been to decent universities, haven't had an education, who yet feel that because they can bash away on a typewriter that they can be journalists. Actually,
the awful thing is I disagree with you about that, because I just think, to hell with it. Come on,
Yeah, from your Cayman Islands
my
retreat.
Redoubt.
Yeah, you can. I'm still waiting for that moment. I had another friend of mine from almost actually even further back than you, a guy called Wilton Barnhart, who I'm going to interview at some stage. When we were at university together, we used to talk about the novels that we were going to write, and we were mapping out our literary career, and obviously by our mid-20s or early 30s at the latest, one of the novels was going to come good and we were going to be totally sorted.
Yeah.
And instead, here I am, over 50, none of my novels did squat. And I was on the phone to Wilton the other day, and I discovered that he's had a hit. He had a book called Look Away, Look Away, as in Look Away, Look Away, Dixieland.
Right.
The southern novel that he'd been talking to me about at Oxford when we were both kind of... he was a postgrad and I was an undergraduate, and he finally had a bestseller, which enabled him to buy an apartment in Raleigh.
Jeez.
And I felt so happy for him, because it happens so rarely, doesn't it? I mean, those of us with literary ambitions, we almost always, or our dreams turn to dust.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, absolutely.
So are you writing another book now?
Well, I've kind of got a novel which but on the other hand, it doesn't quite work at the moment. I need to do some stuff with it, and I'm doing a proposal for another non-fiction book. But
oh my god, that's a phone thing.
It's yours, not mine.
I know it is. Hang on, it's gonna. So that call's completely thrown me off my stride, because it's just like an annoying. While we're on the subject of how awful this modern age is,
yes,
that is a call allegedly from my bank, from their fraud prevention department, telling me that there's been activity on my card. Yeah, like me using my card. And now they want to turn over my life and waste my time policing, and they're saying they're doing it for my best interests.
It's not a human being saying that, it's a robot saying that.
It's a robot. Yeah. Of course, that's the other element. You think it's not even legit.
I strongly suspect not.
But you know what? I've been through this thing where you kind of go, yeah, fuck them, I hate them. I hate all this kind of Nazi policing going on of my account. It's my account and I'll do what I want. And then what you find is very quickly you get locked out of your account.
Yeah, no,
and you can't use your cards.
Yeah.
This is the hateful world. Everything was much better when we were younger. Do you not think?
No, I absolutely don't. I think life was absolute hell when if you tried to... no, I really don't think things were better.
Mind you, you're older than me.
I'm much older than you.
How old are you?
Older than you. I don't even want to tell you how
okay.
old I am.
But you are about 10 years older than me, and I agree. You lived in the dark ages, and you hated your public school, didn't you?
Yes.
You were bullied and
all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
You see, I wasn't as bullied as much as you were. So I lived through the 70s. You probably lived through the sort of the 60s, austerity Britain, tail end of.
Yes, actually. Yeah, that is true.
So you had to make your own entertainment with a hoop and a stick, and you probably ate Heinz baked beans out of all
those things are unquestionably true. Yes.
Yeah. So why do you think things? Actually, I look at your kids, and I have to say they do have a rather better lifestyle than you have.
Of course they do.
Yeah. But you must admit there's some things wrong with this modern world.
I think there are many, many, many things wrong with it. But actually, I would hate to go back to the 1970s, which was just unbelievable, because I spent a lot of time researching it. It was just unbelievably hellish. Nothing bloody worked. It was catastrophic. I remember walking through Leicester Square when there was a kind of rubbish collectors strike in the 70s, And there was this amazing rustling sound, and it was at night. And I thought, Jesus, what's that? I thought it was the wind blowing through the refuse sacks. And it was rats running through the bloody refuse sacks.
You were going to say it was the rats, yes. Yes, and of course, there were the power cuts, which I remember as an incredibly wonderful, glamorous thing.
They were, of course, incredibly exciting.
Because you had to get candles and stuff.
Yeah, it was great.
And it could go off at any moment.
Yeah. No, I loved all that. But I'm just pleased it doesn't happen now.
Yeah, but we've got other things. Like I do worry about being massacred when I go to the mall and stuff, which wasn't... Okay, we had the IRA, but it wasn't quite the same, I don't think.
I don't know, actually. I remember being very, very nervous travelling on the tube
in
the 70s. And the IRA, I remember, had a brilliant plan that was only very narrowly thwarted, which is that they'd worked out that there was a reservoir somewhere in Hackney, I think, and that if they blew up the reservoir, which presumably was quite high up on a hill, this enormous tidal wave of water would rush down into the tube station, sweep around the Circle line, and electrify and completely short out the whole of the London Underground in about 35 minutes.
And would it have drowned people as well?
I don't know if it would have drowned people.
No.
It just would have kind of, paralysed the
that
city.
would have been quite ingenious. Okay, so I remember what happened when the bloody evil phone call interrupted. We were talking about your next book, which we don't know what you're not going to say what it's about.
No, I'm not even going to tell you what it is because I don't know if it'll work out. And I sort of toyed with the idea of doing another political scandal, but actually the Thorpe one is so good that anything else would be kind of rather sort of skimmed milk by comparison.
Yes.
I toyed with the idea of doing Stonehouse, which is a very good story, John Stonehouse story, but actually because he faked his own death and then was only discovered because the police thought he was Lord Luke. And
where did he end up?
He ended up in Australia with his mistress.
Yeah.
And yet Stonehouse himself was a rather kind of pompous, humorless man, whereas actually all the kind of protagonists in the Thorpe case are really interesting.
They were proper weird, weren't
they? Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. It's really hard, isn't it? I imagine it's particularly hard when you've had this success d'estime and success de TV. I imagine it must be really especially hard thinking what the hell you're going to do next.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I'm not going to complain about it. I mean, it's not such a bad position to be in.
Yeah, exactly.
I do sort of think, to hell with it. I'm nearly 65. I don't have that much more left to prove.
You've told me your age now.
I know I have.
Do you do any journalism these days?
Well, I do odds and sort of occasional book reviews, and that's about it.
Which pay about 5p.
Yeah, but I mean that's more or less it, actually.
I wonder whether the minimum wage laws even cover book reviewing, because it seems to me the hours you put in relative to the.
I'm sure you're right.
Yeah.
But it kind of beats working.
Yeah, you say that, but you speak again from from your Cayman Islands position. Yeah. Whereas those of us who actually depend on our pen,
I do as well. Believe me, I do.
Look, I know you keep resisting the idea that things were better in the past, but I remember a time when I could spend half the day writing an article, maybe one article every morning a week, or in the afternoons, because I kept the best of myself for my novels, and live like a prince or even an emperor on the proceeds, and have time spare in the mornings to dabble with novels. I can't afford to write novels anymore. I mean that absolutely killed my literary career. I'm trying to work out what to write next, and I've started and stopped loads and loads of books.
But it's a kind of the trouble is, it's not really worth writing novels. I mean, unless literary fiction just doesn't sell anymore. It's a kind of moribund genre.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of people a year who sell well, and if you write detective novels, you've got a chance of selling. If you write fantasy, you've got a chance of selling. If you're writing some book about someone communing with their hairdryer in their bedroom, then it's not going to bloody sell.
Yeah. Hold that thought. I'm going to develop that in the next section. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, John Preston.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I want to actually take a couple of the references to Donald Trump from hip-hop. And then we're going to try to see if we can figure out why they like Donald Trump. Jay-Z said, I'm at the Trump International. Ask for me. Raekwon said, I'm the black Trump. They are comparing themselves to what he represents. His wealth, his achievement, capitalism.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, John Preston, who's getting very agitated. He's got a meeting
Not
with.
that agitated.
He's got a meet. No, you don't. You don't get that agitated. But he's got a meeting with probably a Hollywood super producer, trying to do Thorpe, the superhero movie, based on that. No, the thought I asked you to hold was because you said don't write novels, don't write literary fiction because it's a waste of bloody time, and I kind of agree with you. I very rarely read literary fiction. And when I do, I'm kind of disappointed in some way. And I just wanted to bitch about some of the books that I've bought recently. That there was the one about the written by the Irishman, set in the Wild West, which everyone was raving about. God, what's it called?
I don't know.
You must know. Oh.
I don't know.
I thought you'd know, John.
No, I'm
so it's a book set in. He writes it in kind of Irish for some reason, even though that it's set in America. So I suppose the protagonist is Irish. And you go through the Indian Wars and you go through the Civil War. So you think, what do you do? This is fantastic. You've just got the best material ever. But then they have to make the protagonist gay. Why does he have to be gay? Why? It's not that I'm against gay people, but I just kind of think I need an in. You know, as a kind of average... I suppose what my beef is, why do you never get books about the travails of white, middle-aged, middle-class people like me? That's what I want to know about. That's really what I want to know about.
Well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that, but oddly enough, you know, I'm not gay, but this is the Thorpe story. Is you know, it's all about
what it
was
the way you brought it back
in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like by virtue of this, I'm slightly sort of honorary gay for the kind of time.
Listen, if we're going to have a gay off, I'm so much more gay than you.
I'm not think anyone's querying that.
No, exactly. So thank you. No, it was more of a kind of... I object rather to the creeping political correctness. I mean, it was bad when we were in our heyday, but it's got so much worse now. Let me have another bitch about another book I read, which I really loved up to the point. What was it called? Golden Hill?
Oh, yeah, no, is it by Francis
Spufford.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
So there is a certain element of certain element of sour grapes here, because I asked him on the podcast and he went, who knew? I can't. I suspect because he thinks I'm too right wing for him.
Right.
Read this fantastic evocation of 18th century New York.
Yeah.
And I just think this is awesome. I'm going to recommend this to all my friends. It is just brilliant. It's the best 18th century novel since the 18th century. And you get to the end, and I won't spoil it for those who want to read it, but there is a reveal which is hideously politically correct, which completely undermines everything else that's gone before. You think, you've gone to all the trouble of recreating 18th century New York. It's wonderful, it's exciting, I'm totally with you all the way. Suddenly you dump on me this PC bollocks, and I'm sure that the prize committees love all this shit, and the literary groups, they all love it too. But why can't you write for just ordinary, real people like me? Sod you. Do you not agree with me?
Well, actually, I haven't read it, but I mean, in theory, I agree with you. That's as far as
I know you're not as right wing as me, John. You
No, but very few people are.
There are actually.
No, there are. There are. I'm not saying they're not out there.
They are.
But some of them are in strap-down facilities.
They're in America. And America is where it's at. Seriously, I feel so much more at home in America. At least with half of America. They they don't think of me as a freak. They think of me as
No, I can quite see that.
As it's really quite reasonable. Can I actually, before we go, just one last rant. I was driving back from my Pilates class.
Oh.
Yeah, no, Pilates is good, and actually you should think about this as you get older.
Okay.
Think about our kind of our core strength and stuff.
Yes.
Driving home, and we have to listen to the radio because the wife would talk radio, and they were all so annoying that we ended up listening to Radio 3, which ought to be the salvation because it just plays just classical music, which is fine. How politically correct can you get classical music? Well, it turned out that there was some kind of gramophone awards, and there was a speech by Nicholas Sirota, formerly in charge of the Tate, now in charge of something else, and he was talking like a vicar about the need for more diversity in the, and everyone there agreed that there was need for more diversity in the arts and more female composers and stuff. And I was thinking, hang on a second, who agreed this stuff? Actually, I want whoever's good to be writing classical music. I don't care about their sex or their race. I just want good shit played really well. Why can you not understand that is your job? I hate you lovers. No?
Yes.
That's
endorsed.
Right. That's good. That's right. The good thing about this is sometimes that I just have to rant to my guests.
You end up doing both parts.
They can just agree. They can just agree with me. So thank you, John Preston, author of, remind us again,
A Very English Scandal.
A Very English Scandal, for listening to my rants, and thank you for your great books, which I really, really recommend. We haven't even got onto your Sutton Hoo book, which is another great one. Thank you for being a great guest.
Thank you very much indeed.
That was the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, John Preston. Thank you and goodbye.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
A lot of people not knowing what action they could or should take to make the difference. What I do is try to turn people on to sites like Breitbart, people who are writing and publishing the truth so that people will get educated. But, you kind of can't blame productive members of society who are kind of confused, perplexed as to what do we do to